Afternoon all. I'd like to do a video on a number of subjects and using a number of examples. It's probably quite an ambitious video. I still want it to be less than 20 minutes or less than half an hour at most. The subjects which I think are interrelated, which I want to cover, are assessing tactical threats, blunder checking, weakness of the last move, and empathy for master games when you try and play through or appreciate what's going on in master games or other people's games, if you have their game score, to appreciate why certain moves were played. Now, a lot of us do have chess database software, and some of this is not just about playing chess but appreciating chess using software as well. So why do I think these sort of subjects interrelate? Okay, well, recently, as far as empathy for master games, I felt very guilty recently in looking at the Plaskett versus Miles game, and we reached this position where I was a little bit confused by bishop h3, wasn't entirely sure what it did. I thought it might be in some way preparing g4, and what anyone can do is, with chess software, as well as adding a Qd6 in ChessBase Lite, for example, and I'm pretty sure most software will support this in one way or another, is to try and get an indication of threat. And the technical way which a lot of chess software does this is basically pretending as though the opponent has lost their move, so you get two moves in a row. And I thought that's a neat software trick, and we can do this in ChessBase Lite, for example. We can say analyze threat, and it's basically that you can pretend as though it's white to play again, and we see that the threat is knight takes e4 is implied by bishop h3. And so here we all of a sudden might get some empathy which we didn't have for this master game on one end, on one angle of this, that now that we see that threat we get empathy. But also, isn't it a useful technique in our own games, this idea of pretending almost that the opponent is given two moves? I thought initially, well, that's not even worth mentioning to anyone, let alone on YouTube. But actually, the more I thought about it, I thought actually there's an element of bias removal, because if you pretend you're given two moves for white, you're not actually biasing the picture by giving black a move which might distort things, so you don't end up even seeing the primary threat. In fact, in this position, if you give black a nifty looking move, the threat doesn't even exist now, it's extinguished actually. Knight takes e4, g4 would answer that here in this particular scenario. But in your own calculations, it would be nice to know the actual threat independent of you actually playing a move. If we flip the board here, just to see what actually was one of the major tactical points of the opponent's move before you start analysing your own candidate moves. I know it's often recommended, like in books, Think Like a Grandmaster, to analyse all the candidate moves available, but the opponent's last move from a human being did carry an element of logic and might have had a point, apart from some positional point which you might imagine, but it might have had a specific tactical point. So by actually pretending as though the opponent's given another go, and then also maybe to look at forcing moves in particular, to factor forcing moves like knight takes e4, then you all of a sudden you might stumble across knight takes e4. It's a bit of a subtle one, but these forcing moves would be pointless beforehand, and we've spoke about that in previous videos, that in any case it's good to look at all the forcing moves all the time. So if you were black, to examine this, and if you were white, to always examine knight e4. It just so happens that this move makes the forcing move more effective. The related subjects, again though, assessing threats. So there's knight takes e4 as a threat here, which could be used as a blunder checker. So say you did a move like a5, you actually just technically blundered. It's not because of any grand concepts you've created during your chess career or anything. You've just done a basic move blunder. That's why I think these are kind of logical chess details. The weakness of the last move is another logical chess detail. Even assessing forcing moves are logical chess details, not really to do with grand strategic long-term plans, but just immediately what's happened really after bishop h3. And you might think, well, actually, do our grandmasters kind of above this kind of thing, what we call maybe as a grouping of this kind of detail, logical chess details, are grandmasters above this sort of blunder. Well, let's look at some other recent examples which we presented in videos. So Colson Polgar, if we have a look at the video which we saw in this position, I'll get to the diagram position. Colson, if we flip the board here, had just played f3. Now, isn't this in the area of what we call logical chess details? It's actually a blunder, but it was a rapid game. There's a weakness of the last move, so it's no grand strategy or anything, and which also creates the potential for the existing forcing moves to be more effective. So that after Queen h4, in fact, if we did a threat analysis of this position, there are in fact now 2 threats, not just to the rook, but to the knight, and taking twice because of that pin on e4. Quite a concealed one, that though. If we add a Kibitzer and pretend as though black's given another move and keep it at 2 lines, we see 2 threats. Queen takes e1 and knight 6 takes d5. And in fact, we could focus on the second threat here. We could actually ignore the first best move and look at knight 6 takes d5 if it was black to move. But okay, so the point here is this logical chess detail is nothing really to do with grand strategic planning. So even grandmasters, even the best in the world, and it's happy birthday Magnus Carlsen today, and it just shows even the best can sometimes succumb to what we could group as logical chess details, either weakness of the last move, forcing moves, or just not assessing, threats which stem from a weakness of the last move. A weakness of the last move might generate a greater effectiveness of existing forcing moves, because you could also look at the existing forcing moves in this position, and you can see a relationship between a weakness of the last move and those existing set of forcing moves suddenly becoming more effective, because all of a sudden the queen's now pinning this pawn, so this taking on d5 is all of a sudden more effective. But let's have a look at some more examples to try and reinforce this relationship which I'm trying to depict here. A recent game, Morozevich against Domingo Perez. Go to the diagram position. Morozevich had just played bishop h4. Now if white's given another move, let's do the basic threat analysis to just try and appreciate what black has to deal with. Black has to deal with bishop g3, which is basically skewering queen and rook. That's the threat that if we wanted to increase our empathy for master games, and we're looking at this and not really paying attention, well, at least we could see bishop g3, but also bishop c4 is a threat, and also knight g5 is a threat as well. In fact, we can increase the number of threats to analyse. It will show bishop g3 as the third one there. So that's implied as part of bishop h4. As it happened in the game, black was kind of aware of that, because we see this move bishop h6 as though Domingo Perez is prepared to answer bishop g3 with bishop f4 maybe in some scenario. But what actually happened now, after bishop c4, it becomes unclear that that defence is available, because there's other forcing moves which complicate the situation here. On rook takes e4, black is potentially still in trouble, because bishop g5, bishop g3, bishop f4, there's actually a forcing move tactic in this position, still using the rook on e4. Bishop takes f7, so if takes, there's knight g5 check using that pin and winning the rook. So it's definitely more sophisticated at grandmaster level. This was a long game, 3-day Grand Prix in Tashkent, but obviously the threat was kind of, black was aware of that, and bishop h6 was an attempt to do something about it. It just so happens that other forcing moves in the position were also significant. So black's actually forced the best move here is probably just rook f4. It's not pleasant. It wasn't a pleasant position from here, but as it turned out, given this was the threat, probably best after taking, instead of bishop h6, to take on e4 immediately. If bishop g3, maybe knight e5. If bishop c4, threatening, or bishop d3, pardon me, bishop d3, probably best in the light of this threat would be to sack the exchange here, and black might be doing okay after c4, b5. Black's got the nice bishops and it would be okay. So that would be a great way of handling the threat without creating too many weaknesses of the last move, which usually are a part of forcing moves. So these four subjects are kind of interrelated. Assessing threats, blunder checking, weakness of the last move, and your basic empathy for master games or other people's games, why decisions were made. So in this case, we have a greater empathy now why bishop h4 was played. It might have had to do with parrying this diagonal for bishop f4. Let's go on to another example. So recently I wanted to create my own threat in my own over the board game. So knight g4, if we did the basic threat analysis, clearly knight g4 supports bishop d4, and I thought that's reminiscent of some tau attacks in the Benoni to play knight g4. It looks stereotypical. So ignoring white's most powerful move here, if we press the X button, we see that black's actually threatening bishop d4 and then to win the exchange. It just so happens that in creating this threat it comes at a big price in this particular position. Then actually knight takes g6 is a very, very powerful forcing move. So on king takes, e takes, bishop takes, another forcing move, rook takes f5, and I'll be significantly worse. So it's good that my opponent's calculation didn't reveal that too clearly, and I was let off the hook there, thankfully. But you can see that the subjects of threats, weaknesses of the last move, forcing moves, and empathy for master games or other people's games is very, very interrelated, and it's not to do with grandiose long-term concepts, but rather logical chess details of the specific position. I hope you start to see that anyway from this, and maybe so the goal here is when stepping through master games, not just, you know, for example, checking the engine analysis, but you know, right mouse click, you can do analyze threat or just the X, and you see what the threats are. So what would white be threatening here? Not much, but after knight g4 I was actually threatening bishop d4, hence you gain an understanding at least why I've played knight g4, regardless of the crushing blow that bishop d4 might be an idea. So you can do that with any master game and you get empathy. You do this with your own games, pretending as though the opponent's got two moves in a row. You're removing the bias of putting your own move in as a response to the opponent's move, and you're thinking, what does their move purely represent if they had another move? It's an interesting idea, I thought, to mention. And in trying to parry the opponent's threat, you don't want to create your own weakness of the last move, which goes very well with a lot of the forcing moves that already exist in the position. So here, of course, knight takes g6 is a very, very powerful forcing move already in the position, and it's made more effective when I've played knight g4. So in all these examples you see these kind of subjects which are related come to play. So logical chess details, maybe they should be grouped up as, and trying to remove bias as well, because if you think about it, by pretending the opponent's got two moves, you're removing the bias. You're not immediately considering your moves, although you might want to immediately consider knight takes g4. You're at least giving the opponent's move a chance to sink in without even considering your own moves. You're saying, well, this is the threat, okay, bishop d4. Then you can start plotting away at your own moves. It's an interesting way of assessing threats, as though the opponent has got two moves in a row. Then you start to work on your solution. Then you question your solution cynically. Have I created an even worse problem, a weakness of the last move? Making sure you're looking at all the forcing moves as part of that. Chess is hard, and this is all to do with logical chess details. Forget about grand plans. This is right on the surface, and blunders do occur right on the surface of a lot of games. Let's look at another example. Morozevich was getting done over earlier against Gatukamsky playing black, but now it seems in a Petrosian-esque sort of way, black's got a lot of weaknesses. Even though he's a pawn up, his own king's starting to be fragile on potentially the G file and other aspects of the position. Knight f5 seems to have one major threat against the rook, which was parried, but there's also another threat. Now if we add a Kibitzer to try and get empathy for this position and the difficulties, there's actually, the major threat is actually not to do with knight takes rook, but actually rook d(e1), and the idea of that, queen c3, and you might play another forcing move, a check, and then you might play rook e3, and all of a sudden it's really getting tricky. So we can see this here, that there's starting to be a lot of forcing moves available for white. But given the power of rook d(e1), basically that has to be prevented, as well as this knight takes rook, leaving black with only basically one move to try and survive this position, which is an unpleasant position compared to what it was for sure. But that was doing, as I say, very, very well before. So rook g5 would cling on here with potentially you know, a good position as well, still with some advantage. But okay, so there were actually two implied threats here, and could we class this as a blunder or a very difficult position? Well, by this stage it was a very difficult position, as I say. If we went back earlier in the game, black, you know, had ambitiously opened up the g5. It looked really aggressive, this stuff, and it looks as though black technically was doing really well, but as I say, it started to get tricky once the knight was f5 in any case. So we can hardly blame Gatukamsky for not clinging on in this position with rook g5. There were two major threats to consider. He just considered the rook, and after rook g6, his position was destroyed really. Queen c3. Now there's a forcing move check, another forcing move here, and all of a sudden he's got a wrecked position. He actually has to resign after queen b2, rook takes h3 check. So at the grandmaster level, forcing moves, assessing threats, and sometimes multiple threats on a single move need to be factored in, obviously, and your own weakness for the last move. So logical chess details do creep in to grandmaster games on this evidence anyway. So I hope there's a lot to think about. Okay. Comments or questions on YouTube? Thanks very much.